Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Sonic the Hedgehog from 2020. Now, I've had this movie recommended to me a couple of times, and I know some people who really like it. I have never gotten around to it for a couple of reasons, mainly because it just doesn't interest me that much. And I don't want to say that as like necessarily a negative. It's a totally neutral feeling of just like no inherent appeal to it, and therefore no drive to really get around to it. But I can't even remember what was it today that brought it back up. I decided to get around to finally watching it. I have now found out that I knew there were now 3 of these movies out. I found out today there's also a 4th that is in the works, which doesn't really surprise me under the circumstances. But the context is interesting. I have very little prior attachment to Sonic the Hedgehog as a franchise. It's not my childhood game or any such thing like that. It's just, it's a thing that exists, and I've played some of the games, but I don't have a nostalgic attachment to it, other than in very cursory sort of tertiary ways. So my particular interest in Sonic as a franchise, as an IP, as a character, and all of the things that are associated with it is fairly limited. Even if I do have enough experience with it and knowledge from general cultural osmosis that, I have enough to go into this with. But this movie always struck me as weird to exist from the beginning for a couple of reasons. And I guess the first and foremost is really just, I don't particularly like any of the movies that are mixing sort of fully CGI characters with live action or that sort of thing. I don't think there's anything inherently like artistically wrong with them, but more often than not, I find they are missing the forest for the trees. It's more of a tech demo more often than not than anything. And I think the most obvious version of this, as I think we've talked about on this show before, is the Disney quote-unquote live action. I'm doing air quotes with my fingers here. And I hate that terminology because it is specifically from Disney and Disney's marketing, because it's not live action. This movie is actually live action in a substantial amount. A lot of those Disney movies are not, or barely are. And while I have, like I said, I have no artistic problem with doing lots of CG, I think some of the like Star Wars series that have come out have made a really good point of what you can do with both in-room and post-process CG. There's some really interesting technical innovations that have gone into that space, but that does not cover the same kind of thing as what I would call the live-action CGI mashup movies. And this sort of falls into that camp, though it's not nearly as egregious as some that I think of. The other it's hard to get away from the initial marketing that went into this movie. And I'm not entirely sure that it wasn't a psyop, to be totally honest. For those who weren't aware of it, either because weren't paying attention to it at the time or weren't present, depending on how long it is since this video comes out that you're watching it. When this movie initially got announced, there was a lot of talk about it because it's a very beloved franchise, among other things. People have a lot of attachment to this series, to the characters, and they want to see it done right. And so when they did, I don't remember if it was leaks or fake leaks or actual deliberate, I think it was a combination of fake leaks, real leaks, and then an actual trailer they released. And people did not like what they saw. It was so bad it became a joke in another movie, which I think it was the Rescue Rangers movie, which I haven't actually seen, but that's a whole other topic. It was a joke how bad Sonic looked. Like, he didn't look like Sonic at all. He was a blue monstrosity with horrible teeth that nobody wanted to look at. It really freaked people out. And like I said, I'm not convinced that wasn't a psyop. I'm not convinced that the whole point of that wasn't to get a huge amount of talk about a movie that had not come out yet, because that's absolutely the kind of thing that marketing people love to do. It would be a very expensive psyop. Well, actually, apparently not, because apparently it only cost them like $5 million to redo all of the Sonic footage in the movie, which is crazy. But yeah, apparently that's all it costs. And marketing wise, I mean, usually in Hollywood, the assumption from an outsider perspective is more often than not the budget for the marketing about matches the budget for the movie itself. So whatever number they tell you for the movie, they spent the same amount on the marketing. And if you can get free viral marketing by making something horrible and offensive, but that is like horrible and offensive in a way that is just bothersome, not actually like trouble, and then you can show that you like recovered from that and redid the model and all that, that's really good return on investment if it only cost you $5 million. So nothing that I am aware of has ever come out to suggest that it was in fact intentional, but I fully believe that it's the case that it was intentional. I can't believe they actually looked at that thing and said, that's fine, that's what Sonic should look like. So it's hard to get away from both that initial release, which looked awful, and then my own like internal skepticism about the industry and how it operates, to go, oh, it got a lot of marketing because of this whole thing. And not already having any real attachment or investment, I was more like, oh, at the time it was both when that initial trailer released and then when the movie actually released, my feeling was, oh, okay, I guess they were really going to screw it up and then they didn't screw it up. Fine, I'm still not really interested. I'm not going to go do the like, what's the proper term for it? It's not like an outrage view, but that's a thing now, that people go hate watch movies that they think are going to be bad, whether they're bad or not, and then they make huge amounts of money. The Minecraft movie is really a good example of that recently, that apparently people like, but also there's a lot of people who really don't like it and paid good money to go see it, which, if you know how money works and how corporate industry works, they don't give a shit if you hate the movie. They care if they got your dollar, and they got your dollar. Anyway, I'm going on a tirade. My point being here that I didn't really have a lot of investment or interest in this, and it didn't look that engaging, and it was doing a bunch of things that I didn't particularly care for or really wasn't interested in. So I never got around to it. And so to finally come around back to it after, all this time, when it's now gotten 2 sequels and a third on the way, and people have seemingly enjoyed it a lot, that's a lot of context to come into this movie with, even not really knowing much about it. And yet at the same time, given the amount of marketing that went on around that, like, I saw little clips and trailers and things at the time, and so I had seen bits and pieces of this movie. And in fact, I've seen scenes that were, in the first trailer and then redone in the second trailer and then shown in the final movie, which is weird. It's a weird way to digest any piece of art. But as always, I try and watch things with as neutral a thought going into them as possible. With all of that context, I was not really super hopeful, but not down on this movie going into it. And yet I had come out of it weirdly disappointed in a variety of ways that I kind of didn't expect to. I thought this would be curious, strange, do some odd things that I could comment on. But weirdly, I have very little to say about the movie overall. I'm going to say a bunch about it because I've created meta text to talk about here, but the movie itself is so neutral and inoffensive and generally pretty safe and frankly lacking in content that there's not a whole lot to say about the actual arc of the movie itself. The movie's plot is incredibly thin, and weirdly actually kind of fails at its own plot, or is so confused or unfocused on its own plot that it kind of just drops the ball randomly at a bunch of points. But it's so it's not trying that hard in the first place, so it's not bothering you that much when it doesn't do a lot, or when it does something that's bad. And so I find myself watching through this movie just trying to figure out what it's trying to do, who it's targeted at, what the intention is, what the adaptation is trying to do from the original IP, all these sorts of things. And not being a Sonic expert, I have limited context for this. But I think the first thing that came to mind while watching this was the opening scene is so strange. The opening is 100% CG. This is basically an origin movie from all the way through. So this is a rewrite of the Sonic narrative IP. And that's not to say that Sonic has the most consistent story history as far as I'm aware. It's gone through a lot of iterations over the last 40 years now. But they're rewriting it again, which is not inherently a bad thing. But what confuses me, especially whether you're coming into this as a big fan of the Sonic franchise, or as a new viewer with limited context, or if you're coming in as a kid with no context for Sonic at all, possibly, that makes the read on the entire narrative kind of extra strange to my mind, because this is a movie that to me seems to be very targeted at a very young audience. Now, it's certainly going for the nostalgia dollar too, and that is a substantial portion of where I think it's got its revenue. But for the general structure, the general depth, and the characterization, and the plot beats, that all feels like it's targeted at a preteen audience, very young, kind of short attention spans, and not a lot of complex narrative storytelling. That's no surprise, It is interesting in contrast, however, to something like Detective Pikachu or something like that, which goes a little bit darker, a little bit older, a few of these other things, and has a little bit more of a secondary appeal to an older generation of Pokemon fans. I'm not going to talk extensively about the comparison between the two, but I always think it's an interesting comparison in a lot of ways, especially since it came out, I think, a year or less before this movie. But as far as the plot goes and the way this movie opens, the movie opens with very little explained. It's very fast paced. It's trying to set you up for understanding who and what Sonic is in the most rudimentary of ways. But the whole first scene is basically Sonic lives in a paradise where he likes to go fast. Then he has an owl mentor / parental figure person who tells him not to go fast because he might get in trouble. And then he immediately gets in trouble. And then the mentor this is the first scene, so I don't feel like it's spoilers. The mentor either is injured or straight up dies. And Sonic is shunted into Earth, which is a lot to take in a single scene. As somebody if you were a young kid with no context for Sonic whatsoever, maybe you wouldn't think about it that much and you'd just take it at face value. But I still think that kids tend to think about at least some basic character logic, you know, trying to process the idea of, okay, who and what is Sonic? What are Sonic's powers? Who is this owl parental figure? How important are they? Like, kids are still going to like suss out the relationships between characters and the importance of them. And so to go from like paradise to character death in like 3 minutes is crazy. And if you are a more experienced person within the IP, to me, the characters that attack and try and capture Sonic at the beginning appear to be echidnas, but I don't know that for sure. And it's never addressed. None of this whole scene is ever addressed again at any point throughout the movie. I think it probably maybe sets up in later movies. It's probably used somewhere there, but it never comes up again in this movie. It's entirely a set piece to explain why Sonic is on Earth, and we just kind of go from there, where it's like, okay, now Sonic is a reclusive alien thing that lives on Earth, and hides from everyone out of fear, and also having been told from the young age by a dying parental figure to, you know, stay safe and hidden, because that's how he had lived his entire life up to that point. We have no concept of how old Sonic is or how long he's been on Earth, as far as I'm aware. And yet, like, he's clearly aged dramatically from the initial scene, but he also seems to be he goes through like a very aggressive emotional arc of, oh, I've been living in this place forever. Oh, suddenly I am realizing that I am very alone in the world and lonely, and the like parasocial relationships I've developed with people that I only know from a distance has made me have a lot of feelings, and then something bad's going to happen that's going to trigger the rest of the events of the film. And that's again a lot to process on its own from like just a basic emotions and emotional logic standpoint. But then you're also trying to digest this kind of flickering switch between character experiences, where you've got Sonic, who you were set up with, but also seems to be a stranger in a strange land situation, whereas everybody else is just normal humans. Everyone's normal humans, except for Robotnick. We'll get to that. Everybody's just normal humans in normal human world, and they're having their kind of basic normal human lives, and in the most basic way possible, because again, it's targeted at a very young audience. These are not complex people with great depth of character and actual serious life struggles. They're, you know, proxies for kid problems, basically. This is a common thing. It's not a problem thing, but having adult characters in kids movies who are having adult problems but are really representative of kid problems, like, I want to go out and see the world and do something more with my life than be in a small town. That's a very like kid relatable thing, even though it's about an adult. So that's what's going on with Tom, I think his name is, and so like everybody else is just having very basic human events go on with them. So the process of mashing those two narratives together and then bringing in an actual arc, an actual struggle, is blunt and aggressive, to say the least. It's very like it's both very clear cut and completely unexplained what happens, basically. In the weirdest sort of way. I'm just going to go ahead and say the rest of this is going to be spoilers or spoiler adjacent, because I'm not going to explicitly talk about everything, but there's not a lot to spoil in this movie. And if you're really that attached to it, then go watch it first before you watch my video. So Sonic like has a freak out and like powers up and does a big like sonic boom, no pun intended, that ripples out and like takes out the power grid for the entire Pacific Northwest somehow. And then that's why Robotnick shows up in the army and all these other things, and is the inciting incident for why Sonic meets Tom, or James Marsden's character. I'm just gonna say James Marsden from now on, because it's like, oh, okay, now you're like alien on the run, hunted kind of thing. This gets into some like sort of E.T. adjacent narrative beats where it's like, oh, you know, the forces of evil are the powers that be, you know, the government or whatever nebulous organization is interested, but in a somewhat clear, somewhat unclear way. Now, I will say that, like, they don't really at any point explain who Robotnick truly is, why he wants what he wants, what his, what any of his orders were, because he apparently works for the military, but that's never explained either. And it's really all very surface level just to get Robotnick, a crazy madman, in there so that he can be weird and try and attack Sonic. That's all it is. The rest of it is very surface, to the point where it just raises, as with many things in this film, raises a lot of questions of, if you're interrogating it a little too deep like I do, questioning like, why did you even make the narrative this complicated then? Why couldn't you have just made like, why'd you involve the military or the government or any of that? Just have you know, Robotnick be a crazy scientist who detected the thing and just shows up. Simpler, cleaner, doesn't require all this other stuff, and none of it has to be explained, because you already have something that doesn't make sense, where Robotnick rolls up in his, like, you know, $1 million truck full of crazy tech that isn't ever explained either, that has nothing to do with the military. It's all just fluff that doesn't really need to be present for narrative clarity, and eats into time. And so that's then the inciting incident for Sonic to try and get away, to leave the area, to leave Earth, and then he gets in trouble and there's shenanigans, and then suddenly, all of a sudden, like very abruptly, he and Tom are on a road trip. They're just gonna drive to San Francisco. We're not gonna ask why Sonic doesn't just run to San Francisco, because he can run a lot faster than they can drive a truck, because if you try and apply any logic to this movie, we're just not going to, because, you know, that would undo the entire movie if you tried to apply even game logic to this movie. So I'm not going to do that either. That wouldn't be fair. So then they're on a road trip, and then most of the movie is this very loose sequence of events. It's basically just a couple of individual long scenes with some kind of like juvenile comedy, slapstick humor, these other things. This movie, not once but twice, steals a scene that X-Men did not once but twice, with Quicksilver. I don't know. They already beat the dead horse when they did it again in a different movie, a different X-Men movie, and then Sonic does it twice in one movie and does it worse. So I know people who I know the kids who watch this movie haven't probably seen those X-Men movies, but it's the bit isn't that good in the first place, and then you execute it poorly, and then you do it twice. So anyway, I digress. Most of the actual content of the film is just Sonic getting into shenanigans, which again is not necessarily a problem. It's more that it's kind of pointless. It doesn't build the camaraderie. If we're supposed to care about Tom's character and his bond with Sonic, and there's supposed to be some sort of character arc and like emotional evolution between the two, that is what's set up by the end. Near the end of the film, they're like, oh, we've bonded now. And I'm going, have you though? You guys have known each other for like 48 hours, and all of the stuff you guys got into, none of it ever seemed to have a meaningful like setup and payoff for you guys having a better understanding of each other. It was just James Marsden in this scene is very confused, and then James Marsden in this scene is treating him like a buddy, and then James Marsden in this scene is emotionally attached to Sonic in a kind of cursory way. There's no real emotional evolution. And as I've said many times on this show, I think kids deserve that. I don't want anybody to just say, oh, well, that's too complicated for kids or something like that. Clearly it isn't. Like, we've watched other movies on this show and off. I've watched plenty of others off this show that are aimed at this target demographic or younger, where there's a lot more character development and emotional engagement. You can't say that isn't for kids. It is. You've just chosen not to do it. So I'm not letting the movie get off with not doing that. So you have a bunch of like scenes that aren't that entertaining to me because they're not targeted at me as a demographically. They don't seem to have any particular payoff to the arc of the movie. They don't seem to have any emotional payoff to the characters. It's all just kind of a series of bits, which is fine if you just want something for the kids to stare at for an hour and a half. But this is a movie. You should strive higher than that. I mean, if you just want the kids to stare at something, that's kind of what TV's for. Not to denigrate TV, but like that's more what shorter form content is for. If you're making a 90-minute feature, 90-plus minute feature, it should have an arc. It should have development. It should have character. It should have all of these things, or at least some of them, no matter who it's targeted at. And so I'm bothered to see a movie that is dull in its plot, in its characters, in even its production value can be really up and down. Like the CG generally looks quite good. I don't have a huge amount of, I don't have any big gripes about it. I could nitpick it a lot. There's a lot of little things that I don't particularly care for, or think they shouldn't have done as CG, or that is like small things here and there, or completely illogical in world. But that's nitpicking beyond my level of what I think is an appropriate level of nitpicking. So I'm not going to do that. But it's sad to see this movie end up dull, especially for a franchise that is so important to a lot of people. I don't have a lot of attachment to Sonic, but I think Sonic deserves better than this. And thankfully, Sonic is probably one of the better characters in the film. He has some development. It's very detached from basically anything that happens to him, but he at least has, like, as an origin story, this is fine in a vacuum for Sonic to go from naive young Hedgehog to naive adult Hedgehog to knowing more about the world and being empowered adult Hedgehog. That's an arc, at least, even if it's not super well set up and delivered. But everything else about it around it is really, in addition to everything I've already mentioned, is doing it a disservice. The acting in this movie is pretty bad. And I know I'm going to say something controversial here. I think Jim Carrey is a terrible Robotnick. hear me out. Hear me out, please. I think Jim Carrey chews the scenery of this movie, and I love him for that. I think his performance itself is really entertaining. I love the performance that he gives in this movie. I don't love it in this movie. I think Jim Carrey, this is sort of back to classic 90s Jim Carrey, the kind of over-the-top acting that he has been historically very well known for, and I think it's him in fine form for that kind of thing. But it's not until like the post-credits scene where he finally starts to click as Robotnick. This is a combination of writing problems, like I mentioned before, where his presence in the film doesn't make a huge amount of sense to begin with. It's set up in a very clunky way. And then his entire like arc of things that he does kind of don't make sense either, because they don't ever say, like, the military doesn't say, oh, we got to kill this threat or something like that. No, Robotnick just takes it upon himself to decide, I am going to attempt to kill this hedgehog in every way possible with massive amounts of collateral damage, firing missiles, bullets, destructive robots, all these other things. Not a care in the world. They blow up the Transamerica building. Who gives a shit? I guess it doesn't matter, right? Because it's beyond any sense, because even when he realizes very late in the movie that Sonic is valuable as a specimen to like power his robots, which is a ham-fisted turn at best, he's still like, even after that point, he's like, I guess I'm going to keep shooting bullets and missiles at this thing anyway, because if I destroy it, I guess it doesn't matter. And maybe this gets to what I wanted more out of this film, which is I wanted it more cartoony. Now, Sonic's IP history is long and varied, and the relationship of the fan base with the various iterations of the Sonic games and Sonic lore and Sonic fan things, that's a whole thing. That's a whole topic that somebody else is more experienced and can say better about more succinctly. But in 2020, this was a weird time for Sonic, where he was sort of on an upturn, but not in the IP was largely not doing super well, had a bunch of kind of mediocre or bad games in the last 15 years prior to that, and it was not doing super well. Meanwhile, these days, it's doing much, much better in the years since, and there are there are all kinds of games. There's games, TV shows, other movies and things that have all done super well. And what exactly you attribute that to, that's a separate thing. But I was going somewhere with this, I swear. This movie, in the context of trying to revitalize Sonic as a franchise, makes it even weirder, because it doesn't do a lot to revitalize old lore, nor does it do a lot to sort of bridge the gap between things, like something like Sonic Boom, which is, I haven't watched, but I've seen bits and pieces, and seems to be much better written, thought out, and generally conceived. The TV show, that is. I don't know about the game. I think the game's supposed to be good too. And so this movie sits in this weird place where it's not doing a lot for Sonic as a character, Robotnick as a character, or the franchise in general, in order to to me, renew the IP. I've gone on another tangent again. This video is getting long, but I do have a couple more things I want to talk about. Back to the discussion of actors. Like I said, Robotnick, until the that post-credit scene with him on the mushroom planet, that's the first time he actually seems like crazed Robotnick with a weird vendetta. He's finally appropriate for the setting. Oh, I forgot the point I was getting to, which is I wanted all of this to be more cartoony. Sonic is inherently like deeply cartoony, like back into the recesses of like Looney Tunes style cartoony stuff. And it doesn't feel like that until that final end scene with Robotnick on the mushroom planet. That's what it should have been from the beginning. Like you can, having everything be set in a very normal human version of Earth is, to me, like the biggest mistake that hampers the creativity or the ideas of what might have been in this movie. Now, I don't know what happens in the sequels. I guess maybe at some point I'll find out what exactly is going on with them, because I don't dislike this movie so much as to not watch the sequels. But this movie was not cartoony enough. And Robotnick is not performed like Robotnick to me until that very final scene where he finally seems cartoony enough for me. Otherwise, it's just Jim Carrey chewing at the scenery in a way that doesn't match the movie or the character to me. As far as the other actors go, this is a fairly short cast list. Most of the actors are putting in, I don't know, I don't want to just say they're putting in poor performances, because the writing's really poor and the direction doesn't seem to have been particularly good either, and they're all staring at what I'm sure is nothing but blue screens. So, you know, concessions need to be made. But yeah, a lot of the acting is pretty stiff and wooden and ill-delivered. James Marsden, I'm trying to remember if I've talked about him on this show before. I mean no offense to the person, James Marsden, when I say this. He seems like he's probably a very lovely, nice person he seems very kind. I find him completely charmless as an actor. He is like the epitome of the thing I always say, the only plays one character and is a version of himself. And he's perfect in certain roles. Like, I think, was he in 30 Rock? Was he one of the boyfriends in 30 Rock? Anyway, he's perfect for that kind of role. And there are a few things I've seen him in where he basically plays a version of that, where he's just like sort of this hapless rube, kind of neutral white guy, and that's fine. He plays that very well, but that's about all he can play. He's got like, as far as being like genuinely charming and interesting and having character depth or like emotional depth, he seems like a completely blank slate to me in every single thing. Again, no offense to the guy, I just don't find his talents talented. And Jim Carrey is being his most Jim Carrey he has been in a while. And then like I would say that Tika Sumpter, I think, who plays Marsden's wife, is like equally wooden. I think I've seen her in like one other thing, and she's totally neutral, fine, I guess. Again, a lot of this is down to questionable writing and stuff, but like also not didn't inspire me in any way, had no character depth, had no like meaningful, weirdly, the most real human character, and I swear to you, the only time I laughed out loud in the entire film was at her sister. Her sister has a couple of like one-off lines, and I laughed at one of them, and that was it for the entire film. I don't mean that as like a particular dig. That's just literally what happened, because I just wasn't entertained that much. And so like suddenly out of the blue, having one character call out the insanity of a situation was like, oh, that's a breath of fresh air. She's like the only one cognizant of the situation that seems to be happening right now. She's the only real person present. A few last things about this actually that wrap into that. There are a few really well done, nice moments in this film. I think there are some emotional beats that, like I said, I don't think are set up particularly well, but do, like in a vacuum, work very well. I think possibly the most like cute and heartfelt moment in the entire film, which is completely unprompted, is the origin of Sonic's shoes, where his Marsden's niece, who's Tika's sister's daughter. Anyway, they go to their house and she's just like, hey, your shoes are worn out. Or she doesn't even say it, but it's just like a nonverbal thing mostly of just like, hey, I've got some shoes for you. And she just gives him shoes and he's like, this is the first time anyone's given me a gift. And I was like, oh, that's really cute. That's like a genuinely heartfelt moment. And it's just like passed on. Weirdly, okay, I did pause the movie to check for reasons I'll get to in a second for my kind of last point here. I paused the movie to check that this wasn't a product placement, and it is and isn't. The Sonic's new shoes towards the end of the film are in fact Pumas, but I'm going to give it a pass because the logo is so tiny. Like, obvious, they're CG shoes, and so like obviously they put it there on purpose. But if you weren't explicitly looking for it, the logo is tiny. You'd never see it if you weren't looking for it, I don't think. So it's just kind of funny to me that one of a prime opportunity for branding and marketing. Maybe something that was vetoed by the IP, by Sega or the IP holders or whoever, or the like creator of Sonic, to be like, no, you can't brand his shoes. They're too iconic for you to do that. I don't know. But it was kind of funny to notice, yes, they are branded, but in the possibly the most subtle way I've ever seen. The reason in particular that I was paying attention to that is because possibly the worst thing in this entire movie is the aggressive, like, beat you over the head with a stick while screaming in your ear aggressive product placement. And there's a couple of different things that it's for, but in particular, it's fucking Olive Garden. Holy shit. Who okayed the product placement scenes? Like, I think you could just straight up cut them out of the movie, but they are so heavy-handed. Like, hilariously bad that the only other times I made any noise other than the one time I laughed were on two separate occasions where I yelled in frustration and pain and said like, oh, come on, at the product placement for Olive Garden. My God, it's like watching a full-on like ad break in the middle of the film. It's so egregious. I have no idea. Wow. I mean, I think it's because it's targeted at kids and kids need lack of subtlety, but like, it's super nasty from an ethical perspective. I think it's disgusting to market pretty much anything to kids, but especially if it's like, hey kids, don't you like Olive Garden? Here's the name Olive Garden. Please harass your parents when you get out of this movie to go to Olive Garden. Just like, you know, the movie told you to. Holy cow, is it bad. There's a couple of other products as well, but that's the big one. And just that, if I wasn't already meh on this movie, that really like grossed me out. As one kind of final closing thought, this is a Sony movie, which fascinates me for IP and rights reasons, because Sega itself doesn't have a movie studio, but they have a movie division, I believe, that works with a lot of their associated IPs to ensure that they're like treated in certain ways. And so having Sony have the rights be the ones who are given as basically a competitor company in some ways to Sega. I mean, they're sort of working, they work together in a lot of things, and Sega doesn't make consoles anymore, so it's a whole thing. But it was just weird to me for a couple of reasons to have that IP switch over. But in particular, this is notable to me because we've talked about Sony and their movie production stuff before, and somewhere in the middle of this movie I had like another thought and a realization of just how many weird feeling Sony movies I've watched over the years. And I mean for like the last 20 years. Any Sony IP movie or fantasy movie or like pretty much comics, whatever else, most of them feel weird in a way that I realized I can't place. Usually I do like enough film analysis stuff that I can be like, oh, it's this shooting style, it's these things here and there. Actually, it's funny because Sony is really well known for their aggressive product placement of their own products in their own movies. So that's kind of funny as a connecting point. But there's just a lot of Sony movies that have come out over the years that feel strange in a way that I have realized I haven't quite nailed down what it is about them. Some of it's about like aesthetics and trends and these other things, and there's so much that goes into movies that I don't know if I can totally I couldn't pick it out what it is by like sheer analysis if I focused on it, but it has me thinking about it again. I'm going to be paying even more attention to things that are made by Sony after this, because it's just a weird feeling. Sony makes some weird shit. Anyway, that's the perfect way to end this video, I think. This was a weird movie that I don't think is particularly offensive, but I don't think it's particularly good. Obviously, it performed very well, and if you really like this movie and you made it all the way to the end while I kind of criticized it, then please, by all means, tell me all about your thoughts on it. And this movie actually got me, as one final thought, got me thinking about the potential of a project I've been thinking about for a long time, about bringing some other people onto this show or an adjacent show to bounce my ideas off of and get their takes as well, and possibly even do some writing projects. So I don't know if that will ever come to fruition or you'll never hear about this again, but it's in the back of my mind because this movie was just so weird as to bring that into my mind again of maybe I should talk to somebody about this. Anyway, thank you for watching an extra long version of Solipsist Watched. I will see you guys for something different next time.